You'll hear it from almost anyone that any man in his right mind should avoid the American woman, specifically the Western woman. The implication there, of course, is that when we speak of Western women, the Eastern women, the women on the other side of the globe, are somehow exempt from it all. And I did make a video a while back, which was more anecdotal than anything else, concerning this fallacy, the fallacy of the non-Western woman. In this video, I'm going to adduce some evidence, some articles, and talk specifically about South Korea. Now, many of you know, as mentioned before, I spent a few years in South Korea a while back. I worked there and I lived there. So it's the Asian country I know best, even though I'm a bit rusty in my South Koreanness these days. And I'm going to show and introduce some articles which talk about the skyrocketing divorce rates in South Korea, specifically in reference to the Asian economic crisis of 1997. Many of you know about that, but basically in 1997, and I won't go into the causes because that's a separate issue, Southeast Asia primarily, Thailand, Indonesia, and so on and so forth, but also South Korea, they're all hit by a very severe economic recession. They had some serious issues. Now, since then, South Korea has recovered from that quite well, in fact. In the process, however, their sovereign debt doubled, so they didn't completely escape, completely unscathed, but that's neither here nor there. But let's talk about South Korea in general. Now, South Korea is an extremely, or was rather, an extremely traditionalist society. The basis of this traditionalism in South Korea is what's called in Korean Yugyo, which is Confucianism, rather Neo-Confucianism. And Neo-Confucianism describing a kind of Confucianism that's only a couple of centuries old, rather than, well over 2 millennia old. And it is differentiated from the old school Confucianism. Now, Neo-Confucianism is also practiced in a very similar fashion in Japan, and there's a lot of cross-cultural similarity between South Korea and Japan, although I will defer. I'm not an expert on either country, but I know a lot more about South Korea than I do about Japan, so I won't talk too much about Japan. But it is a very traditionalist philosophy, and it is, of course, patriarchal, as most traditionalist philosophies were, and family-oriented. And for the longest time, and even persisting to this day, although always weaker and growing weaker as time goes by, Neo-Confucianism has remained a force to be reckoned with in South Korean society and culture. Notions of honor, familial honor, obligation, all of these things, they're all part of Yugyo. It's, I would argue, even part of the language. South Korean, for example, has various suffixes, and they're basically suffixes that you can attach to virtually any word that indicates station. There are so many of them. I can't really count them all because they just. But generally speaking, the consensus there's 7. I, as a foreigner, I've never understood them all. I'll be honest, and they can really. To speak Korean properly, which I can't do, certainly not these days, unfortunately. Is to make proper use of these, and it's this indication of your station in regards to someone else. So you have endings or suffixes that you can attach that will be used in reference to the emperor or king, to those who are your elders, to those who are quote-unquote beneath you, usually age-based. So it's infused in the very language, the culture it is. That is. So you have a very traditional culture, much more so than, say, China. China, during the Communist Revolution, lost a lot of its old school traditionalism, which was replaced by communism and modern thought. They don't have a whole lot of that. Korea never underwent anything like that, so they've retained that to a large extent. So much for that background. So Neo-Confucianism. Of course, in a heavily traditionalist society like South Korea's, you have family structure being very important, with the patriarch, the father, being the head of the household. And that has been eroding very rapidly. Now, this has several causes, but one cause cited by Barbarossa is, of course, the mechanization, technological progression, and I would argue that South Korea is one of the most technologically savvy countries in the world. It has the fastest internet connection in the world. I mean, you can walk there. Most public places in a park. If you walk through a park in South Korea, you have internet access. So it's really savvy in that sense. But specifically, in reference to the 1997 economic crisis, as well as a general loosening of mores, if you will, due to mostly Western influence, likely K-pop, Korean pop culture, and music, things like that, there has been a steady and sharp rise in divorce. So to get an idea of just how steady it is, I'm going to read some information off, and I'll get back to some of the main points. So this is a very brief one. South Korea, July 12th, there's no date there, but it's, it must be at least from 2011. South Korea divorce rate surges. The number of households in South Korea that are headed by divorced adults has passed 1 million, according to a new government report. It says the number of divorced householders hit 1.26 million in 2010, accounting for about 7% of all Korean households. And more than 80% of these divorced households are headed by people aged over 40, with 57% of them headed by women. Go figure. That is a majority, 57%. This is a steep jump of 40% since 2005, but part of a trend that shows the divorce rate skyrocketing since the early 1990s, when it was virtually unheard of and very much frowned upon. Sunu, one of South Korea's largest matchmaking services, had not one single divorce client on its books in 1993. Many people think the big change came after the economic crash of 1997, when men's unquestioned status as the head of the family was fundamentally shaken. Add that to the fact that Korean traditions and taboos are being shattered everywhere you look, it would seem that the rate will go on climbing for a while yet. So more on that in a bit. This is a longer article from New York Times. And it's too long for me to read the whole thing off, but I'll read some of the most relevant bits off. So, rapidly changing attitudes towards divorce, as well as such other issues as marriage, childbearing, and cohabitation, show a South Korea in the throes of social transformation. By the way, this is from 2003, so it's a bit dated. It's almost 10 years old. Still anchored in Confucian values of family and patriarchy, South Korea is fast becoming an open, westernized society, with the world's highest concentration of internet broadband users, a pop culture that has recently been breaking taboos left and right, and living patterns increasingly focusing on individual satisfaction. Social changes that took decades in the West or in Japan, sociologists here like to point out, are occurring here in a matter of years. In the last decade, this is from 2003, mind you, South Korea's divorce rate swelled 250%, in keeping with women's rising social status. Note here, this is not from the article, this is my own personal note. Note here, in keeping with women's rising social status, it is not overtly stated that women are initiating the divorces, but why else would they say it's almost patently obvious? In the last decade, South Korea's divorce rate swelled 250% in keeping with women's rising social status. But it shot up even more after the economic crisis of 1997, which caused widespread unemployment and shook men's basic standing in the society and family, said Hwang Hee-bong, a deputy director at the Korea National Statistical Office. And it goes on, and feel free to read further. There's a bit of information about sort of Korean reality TV shows talking about divorce, and so on and so forth. So we have that. So we see that a couple of things. One, due to Western influence, there's been an erosion of traditionalist values in South Korean society. Things that used to be sort of frowned upon, such as public affection and what have you, that's all changing. But both articles, and you could find others that would point to it as well, point to a pivotal moment or juncture in history, namely 1997, the Asian economic crisis, specifically the South Korean one, where the catalyst, if you will, was introduced, where well, fuel for the fire. I mean, both articles suggest that that during the crisis, when men lost their jobs, were suffering from wide-scale unemployment, divorce rates shot up and have been steadily rising since. Now we need to go back to the idea that women, even traditionalist women, and let's be honest, what traditionalist women really want. Marriage is and has always been in every culture about money to women. It is about cold hard cash. When these men fell on hard times and were unemployed or couldn't earn as much, in economic hardship during the 1997 crisis, divorce rates shot up and continue to shoot up thereafter because, and heavily implied, of course, is that it's women who are doing this. I've read other articles that actually state it matter-of-factly, and I'll try to find some at a later date. But women, yes, women are primarily concerned about money. Women do not have a romantic bone in their bodies. This is one of the many fabrications we've grown up with, and it's simply not true. It's not true in the West, and it's not true in a highly traditional Eastern Asian culture such as South Korean culture. Women care about money. They care about their own well-being. They don't really care much about anything else. And a perfect example of the male utility of the toaster oven who, through economic hardship, lost his job and, of course, was discarded and thrown away like refuse. No woman standing by her man there. He was just a toaster oven. That's what you do to them. By contrast, this is pretty interesting, I think. Back in the day, when things were really traditional, things were different. I do mean really traditional. So let me just read off a little information here. The traditional role of total female submission persisted in Korean villages until relatively recent times. One Korean scholar who came from the conservative Chungcheong region recalled that when a high school friend died of sickness during the 1940s, his young bride committed suicide. Her act was commemorated in her own and the surrounding communities as an outstanding example of devotion to duty. So, of course, women don't know anything about duty. It needs to be enforced upon them by cultural norms that basically shame them into doing that. Now, I'm not suggesting that married or brides who lose their husbands should commit ritual suicide, but it just goes to show that without extremely harsh measures in place to regulate female behavior with regards to marriage, they're going to run hog wild. And of course that they, pretty much only care about money. What other reason could there be at 1997 and post-1997 for the Korean divorce rate to shoot up by such an astounding rate? It just it doesn't add up unless the Asian financial crisis, the South Korean financial crisis, was a catalyst showing that. Remember, we're not just talking about 10%, 15%. We are talking about 250%. 250%. This article that Syed said is from 2003. It's much higher now, almost 10 years ago. So it's all about money. Now, that is the condition. That a traditionalist wife, a traditional woman, will hinge her so-called love on. Women don't know anything about love, but her favors, her sexual favors, And now that Korean society and the traditions and culture are becoming increasingly, well, passé, and they're sort of dissolving as we speak, it's becoming very clear that women just aren't even very interested in it, in the institution. Although it's still there. I mean, for example, the taboo that women in South Korea have to get married before 30, sexual marketplace value in play there, and all of those good things. But I mean, it's just demonstrative, I think, that that's what marriage is about to women. It's about cash. It's about feeling, well, protected, having their comfort, and the man is just the toaster oven. There's one other element I'd like to talk about in South Korean culture. It's a legal matter, and it's quite different. Mind you, one final note, that in an article from this year, 2012, South Korea is number 10 in the country of the highest divorce rates of divorce incidents. So, yeah, it's making some astounding progress in that area. Good for them. But yes, there's one final point I'd like to talk about that is a rarity, and it's something that we don't have here, or haven't had in quite some time, that really only Islamic countries have. And in South Korea is one of the few countries where adultery is punishable as a crime. Adultery is not just you hurting your partner; it is a criminal offense. And I'll read off some of this, and it's not that long. Maybe I can read it all off, and then I'll talk about it a bit. South Korea is one of the few and I've known this since I lived there, so this is just for your information. South Korea is one of the few non-Muslim countries where an extramarital affair makes a criminal offense. Under the adultery law, the convicted can be sent to jail up to 2 years. For the last 2 decades, there have been a few challenges to overturn the law, but the country's constitutional judges upheld it every time. This issue became huge again in 2008 when a well-known actress, Ok Sori, was indicted on charge of, I think it was written by Korean, on charges of adultery. Short history of Korean adultery law. There were various kinds of adultery laws throughout the many Korean dynasties, as in most countries. The first modern age law was implemented by the Japanese government in 1908, 2 years before they colonized the country. As many of you know, Korea was brutalized by Japan during the occupations of the early 20th century. The law applies the changes unequally to the charge unequally to married women. Okay, this adultery law was rewritten in 1953, 8 years later, after Korea got its sovereignty back, with the intent to establish monogamy and to protect women's rights. It was meant that the adultery charge should be applied to men and women equally under the law, and I would agree to that. However, the reality was different, and it was controversial if the law was beneficial for wives at all, as society was still very patriarchal. And, well, in most cases, men still had the better deal in divorce suits because men's extramarital affairs were generally accepted. Yet for a long time, ironically, it was women's organizations that strongly supported the law. They believed that the law would give wives better chances to receive financial settlement for divorce. Where have we seen that before? Changes. Korean women's legal status has been improved, and more of them have become economically independent. They don't tolerate unfaithful husbands and try to hold an unhappy marriage anymore. Adultery isn't something that only husbands could do. More women think they could have extramarital affairs themselves, and they actually do. Naturally, the number of husbands suing against their wives on charges of infidelity has been growing. Now it's criticized that in many cases the law is being abused for spouses to get revenge on each other or to secure financial settlements from divorce courts. There have been 4 petitions to abolish the adultery law in 1990, 1993, 2001, and 2008, and all of them were overruled. So notice when husbands want to I wouldn't say take advantage or to practice the law or to adhere to the law, they're trying to take advantage of it. When women try to do it, it's okay. Numbers. Every year, about 1,200 people are indicted under the adultery law, and about 40% of them are sent to jail. So that's a sizable number. The number of divorced in South Korea in 2007, so it's a bit old, it's from 2008, was 124,600, and about 11,240 couples out of them fought over divorce because of infidelity. about 40% of those, it was the husband. In about 40% of those, it was the husband accusing his wife. This article is unfortunately written in a bit broken English. Miss Ok, a famous Korean movie star, filed a petition in 2008 that the adultery law was an infringement of human rights after she was sued by her husband, Bak Chul. She admitted that she was guilty under the adultery law after efforts failed by the Constitutional Court. After she was sued by her husband in 2007, she had a news conference where she confessed that her husband and she only had a handful of times of sex during their 11-year marriage. Who knows if that's true? She asked him to work on it or divorce her if he didn't want to try. Mr. Bak didn't show any interest in resolving the issue. He didn't divorce her either, and it's believed he didn't do it because he needed her money. There's kind of a gynocentric angle to this. He always had large credit card bills who allegedly spent on drinking and enjoying places like room salons and massage parlors. After 11 years of effort, she got frustrated and had an extramarital relationship with a popular pop singer. Of course she did. Mr. Bak refused to reveal his credit card statements. In the divorce suits that he filed, he was asking for custody, $2,000 monthly expense for the cost of a child, half their assets, and yada, yada, yada. So anyway, maybe the guy was a boozer. I don't know. But this is, of course, an interesting element to the whole picture of South Korean culture because, well, we don't have anything like that in the States. Nothing like that. Adultery is not a crime, and I don't know if it necessarily should be classed as one. It's a difficult question. But just as an example, if I had been living in South Korea in recent times and had been married to my ex-girlfriend, she cheated on me, well, I could have sent her to court and had her sent to jail in theory. So interesting in that respect. I don't know if I'd send her to jail. She probably wouldn't have learned her lesson regardless. It doesn't seem to be much of a deterrent anyway. But no, I do believe in equality under the law, so I think cheating husbands in South Korea should go to jail just as cheating wives should. But you notice how when a woman does it, it's different. So it's always this double standard. And of course, that's a different. By the way, I missed this part. There was a survey carried out last year that reported nearly 68% of South Korean men and 12% of women confessed to having sex outside of marriage. So, I mean, we know that women cheat at least as often as men, if not more. They're just much better at covering up. They're not going to talk about it. That's in their nature. So, yeah, equality under law, no. So the adultery law in South Korea is all well and good as long as it's men getting grilled for cheating, which is, as I said, it's the right thing. If you have a law like that, both sexes need to be punished equally under that law. But when a woman does it, it's an infringement of human rights. It's just really, really weird. So, strange things going on there. So predictions for the future, well, they're not too positive, and there's no reason to be. The traditional society is crumbling. It's disappearing all the time. You know, anecdotally, I have friends who still live there, and they tell me it's just, you know, it's. They say Stardust. I left in 2008. In the 4 years you've been absent, things have changed rapidly. It's just not the same place anymore, and I believe them. Korea is. I mean, this is totally off topic, but I'm actually very impressed by South Korea. They really built themselves from the ground up after near total destruction, colonization, and brutalization at the hands of the Japanese, then the war, and they've done a really great job. I give them props for that. And of course, it's increasing, this technologization, mechanization, and all that good stuff. But of course, the consumerism, which I mentioned in the previous video, and the influence of the West, for better or worse, eroding traditionalist Confucianist values. So that's going to be gone, I'd say, even in a decade. I don't think there's going to be a whole lot left to that. Now, what I'm interested to see is how it actually affects the culture on a micro level. You know, maybe the language is going to start changing. I'll give you an example of that. This is, I guess, somewhat boring to some people, but bear with me. I can't always make everything interesting, so drawing on my linguistic background. Even though language itself is a biological faculty, It's entirely biological. There are cultural elements within a language, and it's hard to say which comes first, but I would argue that the language reflects back and forth whatever cultural elements are present. So one means of expressing respect and deference amongst different people in different languages can be endings or personal pronouns that indicate station. As I mentioned, you can suffix different things to Korean words, much like Japanese. Those of you know Japanese, which will change the status or your approach to talking to someone, whatever station they might have. And in the West, we've had things like that. Some countries, languages, those of you know Spanish and French and German, they have that to a much lesser extent, albeit just in the personal pronouns and some verb forms. And we used to have that in English as well. It's long since gone. Those of you who know the expression ye, well, ye is the subject form of you. You is actually an object, and ye was the polite form to address people you didn't know up until about the early 18th century, and then thereafter it sort of steadily just disappeared. We lost that in English, and it doesn't mean that the culture fell apart because of that, but it's interesting that you can see that this loss of sort of politeness has kind of, disappeared in English. And in American culture, everyone is always on a first name basis. And I don't want to go too off topic here, but I would argue that people who are interested in traditional values, that source, which I'm not necessarily interested in, that often coincides. Walk into any store in the United States, the guy is your best friend, he's calling himself Bob, and he's asking what your name is too, and I'm not used to that. I've lived outside of the States for far too long. So I didn't want to go off too much on topic there, but it'd be interesting to see if that actually starts affecting the language in South Korea as well, with regards to station and how elders are addressed. I believe it is. I've heard reports of elders being offended by the way younger people are talking to them, not using the proper endings and forms, so it's interesting. But yeah, what's marriage about? We know marriage for every woman, no matter what country she comes from, it's about cold, hard cash. It's about money. It's all about the money. There are a few exceptions, right? Women in rural situations. So take the famed YouTuber, I think his name is Wisdom by Logic or something like that. Traditionalist guy who left the United States and is living in the boonies in the Philippines. Married a traditionalist woman in the boonies in the Philippines, rural village. Yeah, as Barbarossa pointed out in his video, women who are living in rural situations see no reason they're dependent on their husbands. They're not going to get divorced. It's only in highly mechanized urban environments where the divorce rates are going to skyrocket. We saw it in China. We see it in India. We're seeing it in South Korea. It is everywhere. So men, do not be fooled that by going abroad you can find a quote-unquote good woman. A good woman, well, it's in that sense a bit of an oxymoron. Remember, women are only as faithful and loyal to you as the benefits you are providing to them. And without an extreme system, and I admit that committing ritual suicide when your partner dies is extreme, to keep that in place, well, good luck. Not going to work. So that's South Korea. That's what's happened to marriage in South Korea and a bunch of other superfluous information. So I hope you enjoyed that little bit, and I'll see you soon. Take care. Neo-Confucianism is also practiced in a very similar fashion in Japan, and there's a lot of cross-cultural similarity between South Korea and Japan, although I will defer. I'm not an expert on either country, but I know a lot more about South Korea than I do about Japan, so I won't talk too much about Japan. But it is a very traditionalist philosophy, and it is, of course, patriarchal, as most traditionalist philosophies were, and family-oriented. And for the longest time, and even persisting to this day, although always weaker and growing weaker as time goes by, Neo-Confucianism has remained a force to be. You'll hear it from almost anyone that any man in his right mind should avoid the American woman, specifically the Western woman. The implication there, of course, is that when we speak of Western women, the Eastern women, the women on the other side of the globe, are somehow exempt from it all. And I did make a video a while back, which was more anecdotal than anything else, concerning this fallacy, the fallacy of the non-Western woman. In this video, I'm going to adduce some evidence, some articles, and talk specifically about South Korea. Now, many of you know, as mentioned before, I spent a few years in South Korea a while back. I worked there, and I reckon with in South Korean society and culture. Notions of honor, familial honor, obligation, all of these things, they're all part of Yugyo. It's, I would argue, even part of the language. South Korean, for example, has various suffixes, and well, they're basically suffixes that you can attach to virtually any word that indicates station. There are so many of them. I can't really count them all because they just. But generally speaking, the consensus, there's 7. I, as a foreigner, I've never understood them all. I'll be honest, and they can really. To speak Korean properly, which I can't do. Certainly live there, so it's the Asian country I know best, even though I'm a bit rusty in my my South Koreanness these days. And I'm going to show and introduce some articles which talk about the skyrocketing divorce rates in South Korea, specifically in reference to the Asian economic crisis of 1997. Many of you know about that, but basically in 1997, I won't go into the causes because that's a separate issue, Southeast Asia primarily, Thailand, Indonesia, and so on and so forth, but also South Korea, they're all hit by a very severe economic recession. They had some serious issues. Now, since then, South Korea has recovered from that quite well, in fact. In the process, however, their sovereign debt doubled, so they didn't completely escape, completely unscathed. But that's neither here nor there. But let's talk about South Korea in general. Now, South Korea is an extremely, or was rather, an extremely traditionalist society. The basis of this traditionalism in South Korea is what's called in Korean Yugyo, which is Confucianism, rather Neo-Confucianism. And Neo-Confucianism describing a kind of Confucianism that's only a couple of centuries old, rather than, well over 2 millennia old. And it is differentiated from the old school Confucianism. Now,